George Strait meets terminally ill girl and grants her last wish. What happens next touches everyone. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hummed with that peculiar frequency that seemed to pierce through walls and settle deep into the bones of anyone who spent too much time beneath them. In room 214, a 12-year-old girl with eyes far too wise for her age sat propped against pillows that had been fluffed countless times by nurses who tried their best to mask the worry in their voices with forced cheerfulness. Emily Parker had been staring at the ceiling tiles for what felt like hours, counting the tiny holes in each square and wondering if someone somewhere had a job that consisted entirely of poking those perfect little dots. Her mother, Sarah, sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside the bed, the same chair she had occupied for the past 4 months, watching her daughter with the kind of vigilance that only comes from knowing that time might be running out. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else that Emily could never quite identify, but had come to associate with places where people came to fight battles they might not win. On the small table beside her bed sat a battered acoustic guitar, its wood worn smooth by countless hours of practice, and its strings slightly out of tune from the humidity of the hospital room. It had been a gift from her grandmother just before. She passed away 3 years ago, and Emily had been carrying it with her through this entire ordeal. Outside the window, the Texas sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Emily of the covers of the country music albums she had collected since she was 5 years old. She had started listening to country music by accident, really. Her mother had been cleaning the house one Saturday morning, playing an old George Strait seed that had belonged to Emily's father, a man who had left when Emily was just 2 years old and whose absence had become as much a part of their family story as anything else. But something about George Strait's voice had captured Emily's attention that day in a way that nothing else ever had. There was something honest about it, something that spoke to a part of her that she did not even know existed. By the time she was 7, she knew every word to every song on every album he had ever recorded. By the time she was 9, she had taught herself to play guitar by watching YouTube videos and matching the chords to his songs. By the time she was 11, she was writing her own songs and performing them at the annual Bluegrass Festival in their small town of Cedar Creek, Texas. Now, as she lay in this hospital bed with tubes running into her arms and machines monitoring every beat of her heart, music remained the one thing that could transport her beyond these walls. If you are listening to this story and finding yourself moved by Emily's journey, we would love to hear from you. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where in the world you are listening from. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of hope and resilience. Emily reached for her guitar with movements that were careful and deliberate. Her strength not what it used to be, but her determination, unwavering. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago, delivered by a doctor whose bedside manner was about as warm as the hospital's air conditioning. Osteosarcoma, he had said, a rare and aggressive form of bone cancer that typically affected teenagers and young adults, but had decided to make an exception in Emily's case. The prognosis had been devastating. With traditional treatment options, they were looking at perhaps 6 months, maybe 8, if they were lucky. The tumor was located in her spine, making surgery extremely risky, and chemotherapy had shown limited effectiveness in cases like hers. Sarah had listened to the doctor's words with the kind of composure that only comes from knowing that falling apart is not an option when your child is watching. But Emily had surprised everyone, including herself, with how she had received the news. After the initial shock and tears, she had looked at her mother and said something that would become the defining statement of her fight. "Mama, if I only have a little time left, I want to spend it doing what I love most. I want to make music, and I want to meet George Strait." The request had seemed impossibly ambitious at first. George Strait was, after all, the king of country music, a man whose career had spanned decades and whose influence on the genre was immeasurable. He was not the kind of person who typically granted audiences to small-town girls from Texas, no matter how heartbreaking their circumstances might be. But Sarah had learned long ago that when it came to her daughter's dreams, the word impossible was not part of her vocabulary. They had tried the conventional routes first. Letters sent to his management company, emails to his official website, phone calls to record labels and radio stations. Each attempt had been met with polite but firm responses from assistants and representatives who explained that Mr. Strait received thousands of similar requests and that it would not be possible to accommodate them all. Emily had not been discouraged by these rejections. If anything, they had seemed to fuel her determination. She had continued writing songs, continued practicing her guitar, and continued believing that somehow, some way, she would find a way to share her music with her hero. Her optimism was infectious, and even the hospital staff had begun to rally around her cause, sharing her story with friends and family members who might have connections in the music industry. Dr. Patricia Martinez had been Emily's oncologist since the beginning, and she had watched with a mixture of professional concern and personal admiration as her young patient had faced each treatment with grace and humor that seemed impossible for someone her age. During one particularly difficult chemotherapy session, Emily had looked up at Dr. Martinez and asked if she thought George Strait would like her version of "I Cross My Heart." "Honey," Dr. Martinez had replied, "if George Strait heard you sing that song, I think he would be honored to share a stage with you." It was during that same conversation that Sarah had made a decision that would change everything. She had been documenting Emily's journey through treatment, partly as a way to process her own emotions, and partly because she wanted Emily to have something to look back on if she beat the cancer. The videos had been private, shared only with close family members and friends, but they captured something beautiful about Emily's spirit that Sarah thought the world should see. That evening, Sarah had set up her phone and asked Emily to sing "I Cross My Heart" one more time. Emily had been tired from treatment, her face pale and her hair covered by a colorful bandana that had been a gift from one of the nurses. But when she began to sing, something magical happened. Her voice, though quieter than usual, carried a depth of emotion that seemed to transform the sterile hospital room into something sacred. The video was just over 3 minutes long, but it contained what Sarah knew was the essence of who her daughter was. At the end of the song, Emily had looked directly into the camera and spoken words that would soon be heard by millions of people. "Hi, my name is Emily Parker, and I am 12 years old. I have cancer, and the doctors say I might not have very long left. My biggest dream in the whole world is to sing with the king of country music, George Strait, just once before I go to heaven. If anyone out there knows him or knows someone who knows him, could you please share this video? I promise I would not take up much of his time. I just want to sing with him once." Sarah had uploaded the video to Facebook that night with a simple caption that read, "My daughter's dying wish. Please share if you can." She had tagged a few local country music pages and sent the link to every person in her contact list, but she had not really expected much to come of it. After all, they lived in a town of fewer than 3,000 people, and the chances of the video reaching anyone who could actually help seemed slim. But sometimes, the universe has a way of surprising us. Within 24 hours, the video had been shared over 1,000 times. Within 48 hours, it had been picked up by several regional news stations. Within a week, it had been viewed by more than 500,000 people and had caught the attention of country music bloggers and radio personalities across the state. Emily had watched the view count climb with a mixture of excitement and disbelief, but she had also remained remarkably grounded throughout the experience. When local news crews came to interview her, she had spoken with the same authenticity that had made her video so compelling in the first place. She was not performing for the cameras or trying to be anything other than exactly who she was, a young girl who loved music and who wanted to share that love with her hero. But as the video continued to gain traction and Emily's story spread across social media platforms, something else was happening behind the scenes at St. Mary's Hospital that would soon threaten everything that she and Sarah had been working toward. The hospital's administration had been watching the mounting medical bills with growing concern, and decisions were being made in boardrooms that would soon have a direct impact on Emily's care. Richard Coleman, the hospital's chief administrative officer, was a man who prided himself on running an efficient operation. He had been brought in 2 years earlier with a mandate to improve the hospital's financial performance, and he had achieved that goal through a combination of cost-cutting measures and policy changes that prioritized profitable patients over those whose care was likely to result in financial losses. As he reviewed Emily's file, Richard saw exactly the kind of case that he had been hired to handle differently. The insurance company had already reached their coverage limits. The family had no significant assets to speak of, and the medical team was recommending increasingly expensive treatments that had little chance of providing a cure. From a purely business perspective, continued care for Emily Parker represented exactly the kind of drain on resources that the hospital could no longer afford. What Richard did not understand, and what he was about to learn in the most dramatic way possible, was that some battles cannot be won with spreadsheets and policy manuals. Some fights require weapons that cannot be measured in dollars and cents. And sometimes the most powerful force in the world is the determination of a 12-year-old girl who refuses to give up on her dreams, no matter what obstacles stand in her way. The morning that would change everything began like any other in room 214. Emily woke to the familiar sounds of the hospital coming to life around her, the soft squeaking of sneakers on linoleum floors, the distant chatter of nurses beginning their shifts, and the ever-present hum of machines that had become the soundtrack to her days. But there was something different in the air that morning, a tension that seemed to emanate from the nurses' station and filter down the hallway like smoke. Sarah had arrived early, as she did every morning, carrying a cup of coffee that had gone cold during her drive from their small apartment 20 minutes away. She had been staying at the hospital most nights, sleeping in the reclining chair that the staff had graciously allowed to remain in Emily's room. But she still made the trip home each morning to shower and change clothes, maintaining some semblance of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. "Morning, sunshine," Sarah said as she entered the room, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness that had become her default setting whenever Emily was within earshot. "How are we feeling today?" Emily could read her mother's moods better than any book she had ever opened, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. There were lines around Sarah's eyes that had not been there the day before, and her smile was the kind that required conscious effort rather than the genuine warmth that Emily was used to seeing. "Mama, what's going on?" Emily asked, setting down the journal where she had been writing lyrics for a new song. "You look like someone just told you that George Strait retired." Despite everything they were facing, Sarah could not help but smile at her daughter's sense of humor. Even in the darkest moments, Emily had a way of finding light, and it was that quality more than anything else that kept Sarah fighting when the weight of their circumstances threatened to crush her. "Nothing for you to worry about, baby girl," Sarah replied, but Emily's expression made it clear that she was not buying the deflection. "Mama, I may be 12, but I am not stupid. Something is bothering you, and if it has to do with me, then I have a right to know." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the door, and Dr. Martinez entered the room with an expression that confirmed Emily's suspicions that something significant was happening. Behind her was a man in an expensive suit who Emily did not recognize, and the formal way he carried himself immediately set her on edge. "Good morning, Emily," Dr. Martinez said, her voice careful and measured. "This is Mr. Coleman from the hospital administration. He would like to speak with you and your mother about some changes to your care plan." Richard Coleman stepped forward with the practiced smile of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before, but there was something cold about his demeanor that made Emily instinctively reach for her mother's hand. He carried a leather portfolio that looked more appropriate for a business meeting than a hospital room, and when he opened it, Emily could see forms and documents that seemed to represent decisions that had already been made. "Mrs. Parker," he began, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was accustomed to being the authority in any room he entered. "I want to begin by saying how impressed we all are with Emily's courage throughout this difficult time. Her story has certainly captured the attention of many people, and we are proud to have been part of her care." Emily noticed immediately that he had used the past tense, as if her care was something that had already concluded, rather than something that was ongoing. She squeezed her mother's hand tighter and waited for him to continue. "However," Richard continued, and Emily knew that everything important was about to come after that word. "We have reached a point where we need to make some difficult decisions about the most appropriate setting for Emily's continued treatment. Our medical team has consulted extensively, and we believe that Emily would be better served by transitioning to a specialized palliative care facility that is better equipped to handle her specific needs." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting them. She had seen the way the billing department had been looking at Emily's file, had noticed the increasingly frequent meetings between doctors and administrators, and had sensed the subtle shift in how their case was being discussed. But hearing it stated so directly still felt like having the ground fall out from beneath her feet. "What exactly are you saying?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "We are recommending that Emily be transferred to Riverside Palliative, a care center in Houston," Richard replied, consulting his paperwork as if the decision was purely a matter of logistics. "They have excellent facilities and staff who specialize in making patients comfortable during their final stages of illness." Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach at the phrase "final stages." She had known from the beginning that her prognosis was serious, but hearing it discussed so clinically made it feel more real and more frightening than it ever had before. "How soon are you talking about?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We would prefer to make the transition as soon as possible," Richard replied. "Ideally within the next 48 hours. This would allow us to free up the bed for incoming patients and would ensure that Emily receives the specialized care that she needs." Dr. Martinez had remained silent during this exchange, but Emily could see the conflict in her expression. She had been fighting for Emily since the beginning, advocating for every possible treatment option and refusing to give up hope even when the odds seemed impossible. The idea of transferring her to palliative care represented a surrender that Dr. Martinez was not ready to make. "Mr. Coleman," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying an edge that Emily had never heard before, "I think it might be premature to be discussing palliative care at this stage. Emily has been responding better than expected to her current treatment protocol, and there are still several options that we have not fully explored." Richard's smile became even more forced, and Emily could sense the tension between the two adults escalating in a way that made her uncomfortable. This was clearly not the first time they had disagreed about her case. "Dr. Martinez, I appreciate your dedication to your patient, but we have to be realistic about the financial implications of continuing aggressive treatment when the likelihood of success is so minimal. The insurance company has already exceeded their coverage limits, and the family does not have the resources to cover the mounting costs. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger at having their financial situation discussed so openly in front of Emily. But she also felt a surge of maternal fury at the casual way Richard was dismissing her daughter's life as too expensive to be worth saving. "Mr. Coleman," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion, "my daughter is not a line item on a balance sheet. She is a human being who deserves every chance to fight this disease, regardless of what it costs." "Mrs. Barker, I understand your feelings, but we have to operate within the constraints of reality. This hospital cannot continue to provide care that we know will not be reimbursed. It is simply not sustainable." Emily had been listening to this conversation with growing anger and frustration, but what bothered her most was the way they were, talking about her as if she was not in the room. She was tired of being treated like a victim, tired of having decisions made about her life by people who seemed more concerned with numbers than with the person behind those numbers. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "I am sitting right here, and this is my life you are talking about. Do I get to have an opinion about any of this?" Richard looked surprised that she had spoken, as if he had forgotten that the subject of their discussion was actually present and capable of participating in the conversation. "Of course, Emily. What would you like to say?" "I would like to say that I am not ready to give up yet," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the fear she was feeling. "I know the odds are not good, and I know we do not have a lot of money, but I am not ready to stop fighting. And I am definitely not ready to leave this hospital where Dr. Martinez and all the nurses have become like family to me." Richard's expression softened slightly, but his resolve did not waver. "Emily, I admire your spirit. I really do. But sometimes the kindest thing we can do is to accept when it is time to focus on comfort rather than cure. Riverside has wonderful facilities and staff who can help make your remaining time as pleasant as possible." "My remaining time," Emily repeated, and there was something in her voice that made everyone in the room pay attention. "You talk about my remaining time like it is something that has already been decided, like there is nothing left to hope. But what if you are wrong? What if there is still a chance, even a small one?" Before Richard could respond, there was another knock on the door, and Nurse Jennifer Watson entered the room with barely contained excitement. Jennifer had been one of Emily's favorite nurses since the beginning, a young woman who had connected with Emily's love of music and who had often stayed after her shift to listen to Emily play guitar. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Jennifer said, "but Emily, you need to see this." She was holding her phone, and on the screen was a social media post that made Emily's heart skip a beat. The post had been shared by a major country music blog with over 2 million followers, and it featured Emily's video, along with the caption, "This brave young lady needs our help to meet her hero. Let's make this happen. Country music family." "Look at the shares," Jennifer said, turning the phone so Emily could see the numbers. "It has been shared over 50,000 times just since this morning, and the comments are incredible. People from all over the world are talking about your story." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she scrolled through some of the comments. There were messages of support from people in states she had never heard of, prayers from families who were facing their own medical battles, and dozens of people claiming to have connections in the music industry who were promising to help get the video to George Strait. Richard Coleman watched this display with growing irritation. The last thing he needed was for Emily's case to gain even more public attention, especially when he was trying to facilitate her transfer to another facility. The viral nature of her story was already creating complications that he had not anticipated, and he could see how it might make the hospital administration's decision appear callous to outside observers. "This is all very touching," Richard said, his voice carrying a note of impatience. "But social media attention does not change the medical realities of Emily's situation. We still need to make practical decisions about her care." "Actually, Mr. Coleman," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying a new authority, "there have been some developments that might change how we approach Emily's case." She had been making phone calls of her own over the past few days, reaching out to colleagues at major medical centers who specialized in pediatric oncology. One of those calls had yielded information that she had been waiting for the right moment to share. "I have been in contact with Dr. Sarah Chen at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston," Dr. Martinez continued. "She has been following some promising research on a new immunotherapy protocol that has shown remarkable results in cases similar to Emily's. She has agreed to consult on Emily's case, and if she believes Emily would be a good candidate for the treatment, MD Anderson would be willing to accept her as a patient." The room fell silent as the implications of this information sank in. MD Anderson was one of the most prestigious cancer treatment centers in the world, and the possibility of Emily being accepted there represented hope that had seemed impossible just moments before. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief and renewed hope, while Emily's face lit up with the first genuine smile Richard had seen since entering the room. But Richard himself was calculating the complications that this development would create for his carefully laid plans. "Dr. Martinez," he said carefully, "while I appreciate your efforts on Emily's behalf, we cannot make decisions based on possibilities and maybes. The transfer to Riverside is already arranged, and we need to move forward with that plan." "No," Emily said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room. "I am not going to Riverside. If there is even a chance that MD Anderson can help me, then that is where I want to go. And until we know for sure, I am staying right here." The standoff that followed would prove to be just the beginning of a battle that none of them could have anticipated, a battle that would soon involve forces more powerful than hospital administrators and insurance companies. Because while they had been focused on forms and policies and procedures, Emily's story had been spreading across the internet like wildfire, reaching people and places that would soon change everything. 300 miles away in San Antonio, Texas, Maria Gonzalez was having what she thought would be a routine morning at the offices of Strait Productions. Maria had been working as a production coordinator for George Strait's touring company for the past 8 years, and she prided herself on maintaining the kind of organized efficiency that kept one of country music's biggest operations running smoothly. She was reviewing the preliminary schedules for George's upcoming tour dates when her phone buzzed with a text message from her cousin Jennifer, the same nurse who had just shared Emily's viral moment with the room full of people fighting for her life. The message was simple but urgent. "Maria, you need to watch this video right now. This little girl is dying, and her only wish is to meet George. Please tell me there is something you can do." Maria had received similar requests before, though not many. Working for George Strait meant that people occasionally reached out through various connections, hoping to arrange meetings or special favors. And while George was known for his generosity, his schedule was notoriously packed, and his management team was necessarily protective of his time. But something about the desperation in Jennifer's message made Maria click on the video link immediately. What she saw in those 3 minutes and 27 seconds changed everything. Maria had been around the music industry long enough to recognize authenticity when she saw it, and there was something about Emily's performance that transcended the tragic circumstances surrounding it. The girl's voice carried a purity and emotional depth that reminded Maria why she had fallen in love with country music in the first place. And by the time Emily looked into the camera to make her simple plea, Maria was wiping tears from her cheeks. But it was not just Emily's talent that moved Maria, it was the courage she displayed in the face of circumstances that would have broken most adults. Here was a 12-year-old girl who was facing death with grace and dignity, whose only request was for the chance to share her love of music with her hero. Maria knew immediately that this was not a request that could be ignored or passed along to an assistant to handle with a form letter. Maria saved the video to her phone and walked down the hallway to the office of Tom Reynolds, George Strait's longtime manager, and the man who controlled access to the king of country music with the vigilance of a Secret Service agent. Tom had been with George for over 20 years, and he had seen every conceivable type of request, from the heartwarming to the bizarre to the downright inappropriate. His job was to filter through all of these requests and bring only the most worthy to George's attention. "Tom, I need you to watch something," Maria said as she entered his office without knocking, something she would never normally do, but which seemed appropriate given the circumstances. Tom looked up from the contract he was reviewing and was about to make a comment about proper office protocol when he saw the expression on Maria's face. He had worked with Maria long enough to know that she was not prone to dramatics or unnecessary interruptions, and the fact that she seemed genuinely shaken told him that whatever she wanted to show him was serious. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside his paperwork and giving her his full attention. Maria handed him her phone without saying a word, and Tom watched Emily's video with the kind of focus he typically reserved for reviewing major business deals. Maria watched his expression change as the video progressed, saw the moment when his professional skepticism gave way to genuine emotion, and knew that he was feeling the same thing she had felt when she first watched Emily sing. When the video ended, Tom was quiet for a long moment, and Maria could see him processing not just what he had seen, but what it might mean for George's schedule and the practical challenges of responding to such a request. Tom was a man who thought in terms of logistics and liability, of security concerns and public relations implications, but he was also a father of 3 and a human being who understood that some things transcended business considerations. "Where did this come from?" Tom asked, handing the phone back to Maria. "My cousin Jennifer is a nurse at the hospital where Emily is being treated," Maria explained. "She sent it to me this morning. Tom, this is not just some random request from a fan. This little girl is really dying and her story is going viral. Look at the numbers." Maria showed him the social media metrics, the exponential growth in shares and comments, the way Emily's story was being picked up by news outlets and country music blogs across the region. Tom could see immediately that this was not something that was going to disappear quietly, and he could also see the potential for public relations problems if it became known that George Strait had been made aware of Emily's request and had chosen to ignore it. But beyond the business considerations, Tom found himself genuinely moved by what he had seen. He had been around enough performers to recognize real talent when he saw it, and Emily clearly had something special. More importantly, he had been around George Strait long enough to know how his boss would react to this kind of story. "I think George needs to see this," Tom said finally. "Are you sure?" Maria asked. "I know his schedule is crazy right now, and I do not want to put you in a difficult position." "Maria, I have been working with George Strait for over 20 years, and in all that time, I have never met a more decent human being. If we do not show him this video, and he finds out about it later from someone else, he will never forgive us. And more importantly, I will never forgive myself." 20 minutes later, Maria and Tom were standing outside the door to George Strait's private office, a spacious room decorated with gold records, awards and photographs that chronicled one of the most successful careers in country music history. George was reviewing song selections for his upcoming album, a process that he took seriously and that typically required uninterrupted concentration. Tom knocked on the door and waited for George's invitation to enter. When they walked in, George looked up from the demo recordings he had been listening to and smiled at Maria and Tom with the kind of genuine warmth that had made him beloved by everyone who worked with him. "What can I do for you folks?" George asked, setting aside his headphones and giving them his full attention. "George, we have something we think you need to see," Tom said. And there was something in his tone that made George understand immediately that this was not a routine business matter. Maria handed George her phone and stepped back to give him space to watch the video. George Strait had seen thousands of performance videos over the years, had been approached by countless aspiring singers and their families, and had developed the kind of professional filter that allowed him to appreciate talent while maintaining realistic expectations about what he could do to help everyone who reached out to him. But from the moment Emily began to sing, George found himself completely absorbed in what he was watching. There was something about her voice that reminded him of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Something pure and honest that cut through all the industry noise and went straight to the heart of what country music was supposed to be about. When Emily looked into the camera to make her request, George felt a tightness in his chest that he recognized as the same feeling he had experienced when his own children had asked him for things that seemed impossible. The difference was that his children's requests had typically involved toys or trips or privileges, while Emily was asking for something far simpler and far more profound, the chance to share her love of music with someone who had inspired her. When the video ended, George was quiet for a long moment, and Maria and Tom could see him processing what he had just witnessed. They had both worked with him long enough to recognize the expression on his face, the look he got when he was making a decision that went beyond business considerations and into the realm of personal conviction. "How long does she have?" George asked finally. "According to my cousin, maybe 3 months," Maria replied. "Maybe less." George nodded slowly, and Maria could see him calculating not just the logistics of what he was considering, but the human cost of the decision he was about to make. He was scheduled to be in the studio for the next 2 weeks, working on vocals for his new album, and his calendar after that was packed with tour preparations and promotional commitments that had been planned months in advance. But George Strait had not become the king of country music by making only the easy decisions, and he had not maintained his position at the top of the industry for over 3 decades by prioritizing convenience over character. He had built his career on the foundation of authentic connection with his fans, and Emily Parker represented everything that he had always believed country music should be about. "Tom, clear my schedule for tomorrow morning," George said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected figures in the music industry. "We are going to Texas." "George, are you sure about this?" Tom asked. "I know how much this would mean to the little girl, but there are a lot of complications to consider. Security, media attention, the impact on your other commitments." "Tom, I have been blessed with a career that has given me more than I ever dreamed possible," George replied. "If I cannot use that blessing to bring a little joy to a dying child who loves music the way Emily clearly does, then what is the point of any of it?" Maria felt tears spring to her eyes at George's response, but she also felt a surge of pride at working for someone who could make a decision like this without hesitation. She had seen other performers in similar situations who had found reasons to say no, who had hidden behind management teams and scheduling conflicts and liability concerns. But George Strait was cut from different cloth, and moments like this reminded everyone around him why he had earned the respect and admiration of an entire industry. "What do you want me to tell them at the hospital?" Maria asked. "Should I call ahead and arrange something official?" "No," George said, a smile beginning to form at the corners of his mouth. "I think Emily deserves a surprise, do not you?" Over the next 18 hours, George Strait's team worked with the kind of precision typically reserved for major concert productions. They coordinated with local authorities about helicopter landing permissions, arranged for a small security detail that could protect George's privacy without creating unnecessary disruption, and reached out to medical contacts to understand exactly what Emily's condition was and what kind of visit would be most appropriate. But the most important preparation was the one George made himself, sitting alone in his home studio late that night, working out an arrangement of "I Cross My Heart" that would allow him to harmonize with Emily's voice in a way that would showcase her talent rather than overshadow it. He had performed that song thousands of times over the years, but he had never prepared for a performance that carried as much emotional weight as the one he was planning for the next day. Meanwhile, back at St. Mary's Hospital, Emily was spending what she did not know would be her last night before everything changed. She had convinced her mother to let her stay up late working on a new song, something she wanted to have ready in case her video somehow managed to reach George Strait, and he wanted to hear more of her music. Sarah had fallen asleep in the chair, beside Emily's bed, exhausted from the emotional battles of the day and the ongoing stress of watching her daughter fight for her life. Emily looked at her mother's sleeping face and felt a surge of love and gratitude for everything Sarah had sacrificed to be here with her. She picked up her guitar and began to play softly, working on the melody for a song she had decided to call "Thank You for Believing," a tribute to everyone who had supported her throughout this journey. She had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours, her entire world was about to change in ways that would exceed even her most ambitious dreams. The morning of what would become known at St. Mary's Hospital as the day everything changed began with Richard Coleman arriving earlier than usual, determined to finalize Emily's transfer to Riverside Palliative Care before any more complications could arise. He had spent the previous evening dealing with phone calls from hospital board members who had seen Emily's viral video and were asking uncomfortable questions about the hospital's handling of her case. Richard understood the public relations implications of the situation, but he also understood the financial realities that governed hospital operations. St. Mary's was a small regional facility that could not afford to provide indefinite care for patients whose treatment costs far exceeded any potential reimbursement. Emily Parker, despite the sympathy her story generated, represented exactly the kind of case that could threaten the financial stability of the entire institution. He had prepared all the necessary paperwork for Emily's transfer and had arranged for an ambulance to arrive at 10:30 that morning. In his mind, the sooner Emily was transferred to Riverside, the sooner St. Mary's could return to focusing on cases that made financial sense. What Richard did not anticipate was that forces beyond his control were already in motion, forces that would make his carefully laid plans completely irrelevant. At 9:15 that morning, Emily was sitting up in her hospital bed, strumming her guitar and working on the lyrics to her new song. She'd been awake since dawn, unable to sleep due to a combination of excitement about her video's continued viral spread and anxiety about the transfer that Richard Coleman was trying to force. Dr. Martinez had assured her that she would fight the transfer decision, but Emily knew that hospital administrators often had the final word in such matters. Sarah was reviewing insurance documents at the small table by the window, trying to understand exactly what options they had if Emily was indeed transferred to Riverside. The financial burden of continuing treatment was overwhelming, but the idea of giving up while there was still hope felt impossible to accept. "Mama," Emily said, setting down her guitar, "do you think George Strait has seen my video yet?" Sarah looked up from the paperwork and smiled at her daughter. "Honey, your video has been viewed by over 2 million people now. Even if he has not seen it yet, someone in his organization certainly has. But even if he has seen it, that does not mean he can do anything about it," Emily said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. "He is probably busy with important things like recording albums and planning concerts. Why would he take time out of his schedule for someone like me?" "Because," Sarah said, moving to sit on the edge of Emily's bed, "you are not just someone. You are an incredibly talented young woman with a beautiful voice and a story that touches people's hearts. And from everything I have read about George Strait, he is exactly the kind of person who would care about that." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of commotion in the hallway outside Emily's room. There were voices speaking in urgent, excited tones, and Emily could hear the rapid footsteps of people moving with purpose. Through the small window in her door, she could see nurses and staff members gathering near the nurses' station, all looking toward the main entrance of the hospital. "What do you think is happening?" Emily asked, trying to see what was causing the disturbance. Before Sarah could answer, Nurse Jennifer burst through the door with an expression of barely contained excitement that immediately got both of their attention. Jennifer was normally calm and professional, but she looked like someone who had just witnessed something miraculous. "Emily, you need to look out the window," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Right now." Emily and Sarah moved to the window that faced the hospital's main parking area, and what they saw there made Emily's heart stop beating for what felt like several seconds. A sleek black helicopter was settling onto the helipad that Emily had never seen used for anything other than emergency medical transports. As the rotors slowed and the dust settled, Emily could see several people emerging from the aircraft. One of those people was wearing a black cowboy hat and carried himself with the kind of confident grace that Emily had seen in countless music videos and concert footage. Even from a distance, and even though she had never seen him in person before, Emily knew immediately who she was looking at. "Mama," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. "Is that really him?" Sarah was staring out the window with the same expression of disbelief that her daughter was wearing. She had hoped and prayed that Emily's video might somehow reach George Strait, but she had never actually believed that he would respond by showing up at their hospital. "I think it is, baby girl," Sarah said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I think George Strait just landed at our hospital." Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Richard Coleman was in the middle of his morning meeting with the hospital's finance committee when his assistant knocked urgently on the conference room door. Richard had specifically instructed that he not be disturbed during this meeting as they were discussing budget cuts that would affect multiple departments. "Mr. Coleman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there is a situation that requires your immediate attention," his assistant said, her voice carrying a note of panic that immediately put Richard on alert. "What kind of situation?" Richard asked, irritation evident in his voice. "Sir, George Strait just landed on our helipad and he is asking to see Emily Parker." The conference room fell completely silent as the implications of this statement sank in. Richard felt his carefully controlled morning spiraling into chaos, and he could see the expressions on the faces of the board members shifting from confusion to something that looked like concern about how this situation was being handled. "That is impossible," Richard said, though even as he spoke the words, he could hear the sound of the helicopter's rotors winding down outside the building. "Sir, he is here with a small entourage, and they are requesting access to Emily's room. Security is asking for guidance on how to proceed." Richard excused himself from the meeting and hurried toward the main entrance, his mind racing as he tried to process this completely unexpected development. The arrival of George Strait at St. Mary's Hospital represented a public relations opportunity of enormous proportions, but it also represented a potential disaster if not handled correctly. As Richard approached the main entrance, he could see a small crowd of hospital staff members gathering to catch a glimpse of the country music legend who had just arrived at their facility. George Strait was standing near the information desk, speaking quietly with Tom Reynolds and looking every bit as composed and dignified as Richard had seen him appear in interviews and public appearances. "Mr. Strait," Richard said, approaching with his most professional smile, "I am Richard Coleman, the Chief Administrative Officer here at St. Mary's. This is certainly an unexpected honor." George turned to face Richard with a smile that was polite, but carried an undertone of seriousness that suggested he was not here for a casual visit. "Mr. Coleman, thank you for accommodating us on such short notice. I understand you have a young patient here named Emily Parker who has been hoping to meet me." "Yes, Emily is one of our patients," Richard replied carefully, "though I should mention that we are in the process of transferring her to a facility that is better equipped to handle her specific needs." The smile faded from George's face, and Richard could see something shift in his expression that suggested he had just said exactly the wrong thing. Tom Reynolds stepped forward slightly, a protective gesture that Richard recognized as the movement of someone who was used to running interference for his employer. "What kind of transfer are we talking about?" George asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that made Richard uncomfortable. "Well, Emily has been with us for several months now, and we believe she would benefit from the specialized palliative care services that are available at other facilities." "Palliative care," George repeated, and there was something in his tone that made Richard realize he had made a significant mistake in how he was framing Emily's situation. "Yes, we want to ensure that Emily is as comfortable as possible during her remaining time." George exchanged a look with Tom that Richard could not interpret, but he could sense that the conversation was not going in the direction he had hoped. He had envisioned this meeting as an opportunity to showcase St. Mary's commitment to patient care, but instead he felt like he was being questioned about the hospital's decisions. "Mr. Coleman," George said, his voice taking on the kind of quiet authority that had commanded respect throughout his career, "I did not fly here today to say goodbye to a dying child. I came here to meet a young woman who has incredible talent and who deserves every possible chance to beat this disease. Now, if you do not mind, I would like to see Emily's room." Richard found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to assert hospital policy with someone whose presence at the facility represented more positive publicity than St. Mary's had received in years. He could see staff members watching their interaction, and he was acutely aware that how he handled this situation would be discussed and analyzed by everyone in the building. "Of course, Mr. Strait," Richard said, though his mind was racing as he tried to figure out how George's visit might complicate the transfer he had planned. "I will have someone escort you to her room immediately." But George was already moving toward the elevators, guided by Nurse Jennifer, who had appeared as if by magic and was clearly prepared to take him directly to Emily's room. Richard hurried to keep up, accompanied by Tom Reynolds and the small security detail that had arrived with George. As they rode the elevator to the second floor, Richard tried to regain control of the situation by explaining the hospital's position on Emily's case. "Mr. Strait, I want you to understand that everything we have done has been in Emily's best interest. We have provided excellent care, but we have reached a point where continued aggressive treatment may not be the most humane approach." George listened to Richard's explanation with an expression that revealed nothing of what he was thinking, but Tom Reynolds was taking mental notes of everything that was being said. Tom had dealt with enough corporate executives over the years to recognize when someone was more concerned with protecting their institution than with serving their patients. When the elevator doors opened on the second floor, George could immediately sense the excitement that his arrival had generated among the nursing staff. He had always been comfortable around medical professionals, having spent time in hospitals over the years, visiting sick fans and supporting various charitable causes. But there was something different about the energy at St. Mary's that suggested Emily's story had touched everyone who worked there. Nurse Jennifer led the group down the hallway toward room 214, and George could feel his own excitement building as they approached the moment he had been thinking about since he first watched Emily's video. He had performed for millions of people over the course of his career, but he could not remember the last time he had felt as nervous as he did walking down that hospital corridor. "Mr. Strait," Jennifer said as they paused outside Emily's door, "I should probably warn you that Emily does not know you are coming. We wanted it to be a surprise." George smiled for the first time since arriving at the hospital. "That is exactly how I hoped it would be." Jennifer knocked gently on the door and then opened it slowly, stepping inside to address Emily and Sarah, who were still standing by the window, trying to process what they had seen on the helipad. "Emily," Jennifer said, her voice carefully controlled, "you have a visitor." And then George Strait stepped into room 214, carrying his guitar case and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had made him beloved by fans across the world. The moment Emily saw him, her face went through a series of expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief to pure joy, and then she did something that surprised everyone in the room. She started to cry, but these were not tears of sadness or pain. These were tears of pure joy, the kind of tears that come when something impossible suddenly becomes real, when dreams that seem too big to ever come true are standing right in front of you, wearing a black cowboy hat and carrying a guitar case. "Emily," George said softly, setting down his guitar case and approaching her bed with the gentle manner of someone who understood that he was witnessing one of the most important moments of a young girl's life. "I hear you have been wanting to sing with me." Emily tried to speak, but found that her voice had completely disappeared. She looked at her mother, then back at George, then at the small crowd of people who had gathered in her doorway, including Richard Coleman, who was watching this interaction with a mixture of fascination and growing concern about how it might affect his plans. Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her own face. "Mr. Strait, I cannot believe you are really here. Emily has been dreaming about this moment since she was 5 years old." "Well, I watched her video, and I have to say, she has got one of the most beautiful voices I have ever heard," George replied, his attention focused entirely on Emily. "And anyone who can sing my songs with that much heart and soul is someone I definitely want to meet." Emily finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You really came here just to see me." "Emily, I came here because your video showed me something that I do not see very often anymore in this business. You reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place. That was not just singing, that was storytelling, and that was real emotion coming through every note." George opened his guitar case and pulled out the instrument that had been with him through countless performances and recording sessions. "Now, I was hoping we could sing together, but first, I want to hear you play something for me. What would you like to sing?" Emily looked at her own guitar, which suddenly seemed small and amateur compared to the legendary instrument that George Strait was holding. "I do not know if I am good enough to sing in front of you." "Emily," George said, sitting down in the chair beside her bed, "let me tell you something that I learned a long time ago. Music is not about being perfect. Music is about being honest. And your video showed me that you understand that better than most professional singers I know. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman was becoming increasingly agitated as he watched this scene unfold. Every minute that George Strait spent in Emily's room was another minute that the planned transfer to Riverside was being delayed, and he could see that the country music star's presence was only going to make his job more difficult. "Mr. Strait," Richard interrupted, "I do not want to intrude on this moment, but I do need to inform you that Emily is scheduled to be transferred to another facility this morning. We have an ambulance coming at 10:30. The room fell silent as George turned to look at Richard with an expression that was no longer friendly. "Mr. Coleman, did you just tell me that you are planning to move this young lady out of the hospital while I am here visiting her?" "Well, the transfer has been planned for several days, and we cannot simply cancel medical decisions based on unexpected visits." George stood up slowly, and everyone in the room could sense that the dynamic was about to shift dramatically. "Mr. Coleman, I think we need to have a conversation. Privately." Tom Reynolds stepped forward, recognizing the tone in George's voice as one that typically preceded difficult negotiations. "George, maybe we should discuss this with the hospital administration." "No, Tom. Mr. Coleman and I are going to discuss this right now." George turned back to Emily with a smile that was warm and reassuring. "Emily, I want you to keep practicing. I will be right back, and then we are going to make some music together." He followed Richard out into the hallway, along with Tom Reynolds and Dr. Martinez, who had arrived just in time to witness the confrontation that was about to unfold. Richard was already preparing his arguments about hospital policy and financial constraints, but he was not prepared for what George Strait was about to tell him. "Mr. Coleman," George began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected figures in the music industry, "before we continue this conversation, there are some things you need to know. First, I did not come here just to visit Emily. I came here because I have been in contact with some people who might be able to help her. Mr. Strait, I appreciate your concern, but the medical realities of Emily's situation have not changed just because you are here." "Actually, they have," George replied. "Yesterday, after I saw Emily's video, I made some phone calls. I contacted Dr. Sarah Chen at Mind Anderson Cancer Center, and I also reached out to Dr. Michael Harrison at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Both of them have reviewed Emily's case, and both of them believe she would be an excellent candidate for experimental treatments that are not available here." Richard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that George Strait was not just a visiting celebrity, but someone who had been actively working to change Emily's medical situation. "Furthermore," George continued, "I have already spoken with the administrators at both facilities, and they have agreed to accept Emily as a patient immediately. All of her medical expenses will be covered by the Strait Family Foundation, along with housing and living expenses for her mother. Throughout the duration of treatment," Dr. Martinez stepped forward with barely contained excitement. "Mr. Strait, are you saying that Emily could be transferred to MD Anderson for the immunotherapy protocol that I mentioned yesterday?" "That is exactly what I am saying, Dr. Martinez. The only question now is whether Mr. Coleman and St. Mary's Hospital are going to cooperate with this plan, or whether they are going to continue insisting on a transfer to palliative care." Richard found himself in a position he had never anticipated, facing a choice between the hospital's financial interests and a solution that would give Emily the best possible chance of survival. He could see Tom Reynolds watching him carefully, and he was aware that their entire conversation was taking place within earshot of nursing staff who had become emotionally invested in Emily's case. "Mr. Strait, this is certainly a generous offer, but there are protocols and procedures that must be followed. We cannot simply discharge a patient to a private individual, regardless of their intentions. "You are absolutely right, Mr. Coleman," George replied, "which is why Dr. Chen from MD Anderson is standing by to coordinate Emily's transfer directly from this hospital to their facility. This would be a medical transfer between institutions, not a discharge to a private party." Before Richard could respond, there was another commotion from the direction of Emily's room. Through the open doorway, they could see that Emily had picked up her guitar and was singing softly, apparently practicing for when George returned. Her voice carried down the hallway with a clarity and beauty that stopped everyone in their tracks. George smiled as he listened to Emily's voice. "Mr. Coleman, that young lady in there has more courage and determination than most adults I know. She is not asking for charity, and she is not asking for special treatment. She is asking for a chance to fight, and I am in a position to make sure she gets that chance." "But the financial implications for the hospital," Richard began. "Will be completely resolved," George interrupted. "The Strait Family Foundation will cover any outstanding balances on Emily's account here at St. Mary's, and we will make a substantial donation to the hospital's pediatric wing in Emily's honor." Richard was running out of arguments, and he could see in the faces of everyone around him that continued resistance to this plan would make him look heartless and obstinate. But he was also beginning to understand that this was not just about money or hospital policy. This was about a little girl who had inspired one of the most successful entertainers in the world to take action on her behalf. "I suppose we could review the transfer options," Richard said finally. "Good," George replied. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a promise to keep to a very special young lady." When George returned to Emily's room, he found her sitting up in bed with her guitar, looking more animated than she had appeared since her arrival at the hospital. The excitement of his visit seemed to have given her energy that transcended her physical condition, and when she saw him enter the room, her face lit up with pure joy. "Are you ready to make some music?" George asked, picking up his guitar and tuning it quickly. "I have been ready for this my whole life," Emily replied. What happened over the next 30 minutes would be talked about at St. Mary's Hospital for years to come. George and Emily sang together with a harmony that seemed impossible, given that they had never performed together before. Emily's voice blended with George's in a way that enhanced both of their strengths, and the emotion that she brought to each song was so genuine that there was not a dry eye among the growing crowd of hospital staff who had gathered outside her room to listen. They sang 3 songs together, including Emily's own composition that she had been working on, which impressed George so much that he asked her to teach him the chords so he could accompany her properly. When they finished their impromptu concert, the applause from the hallway was so loud that it could be heard throughout the entire floor. "Emily," George said as he packed up his guitar, "you have got something special, and I want to make sure you get every chance to share it with the world. Dr. Chen is expecting you at MD Anderson tomorrow morning, and I am going to make sure you get there safely." "Does this mean I am not going to Riverside?" Emily asked. "Emily, you are never going to have to settle for giving up as long as I have anything to say about it." 6 months later, on a warm spring evening in San Antonio, Texas, 60,000 people rose to their feet as Emily Parker walked onto the stage at the Alamo Dome. She was thinner than she had been before her treatment, and she moved with the careful grace of someone who was still recovering. But she walked without assistance and with a confidence that had been earned through months of fighting for her life. George Strait was already on stage, waiting for her with 2 microphones and the biggest smile anyone in the audience had ever seen him wear. When Emily reached the center of the stage, the crowd noise was so loud that it took several minutes for it to die down enough for them to begin singing. What followed was 3 minutes and 27 seconds of pure magic. Emily and George sang together with the same natural harmony they had discovered in that hospital room, but now their voices were being heard by thousands of people who had followed Emily's story and who understood the significance of this moment. When the song ended, something unprecedented happened. The entire audience fell completely silent for exactly 1 minute, a spontaneous tribute to Emily's journey and to the power of music to heal and inspire. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, all 60,000 people erupted in applause that lasted for over 10 minutes. As Emily and George took their bows, she looked out at the sea of faces and understood that her story was far from over. She had beaten the odds, she had fulfilled her dream, and most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most impossible things are just waiting for someone brave enough to believe they can come true. The little girl who had once recorded a video in a hospital bed, hoping that someone might share it, had become a symbol of hope for millions of people around the world. And in a private box overlooking the stage, Richard Coleman sat with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding what Dr. Martinez and George Strait had seen in Emily from the beginning. He had returned to St. Mary's Hospital with a new perspective on what it meant to provide care, and the music therapy program he had established in Emily's honor was already helping other young patients find their own strength through the power of song. The story of Emily Parker and George Strait had ended exactly where it was always meant to end, with music bringing people together and proving that sometimes, when we dare to dream big enough, the universe conspires to make those dreams come true.